One of the most incredible quotes I've ever come across in my life was that great quote by Krishnamurti, in which he says that it is no sign of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. That's a quote that kept coming to mind as I was reading this really moving book by Deborah Heiligman, Vincent and Theo, the Van Gogh brothers. Because Vincent was fundamentally, in the deepest recesses of his being, hopelessly incapable of adjusting to that profoundly sick society. And it was a society that, in some ways, he himself saw as sick. He wrote letters about how dismissive he felt and disgusted he felt by society's pursuit of military pursuits and monetary pursuits, and how much money meant in the world he lived in. It I want to say disgusted him, but it certainly confused him, and he did in some ways seem to find it abhorrent. And he embodies a suspicion that I've had for a long time, which is that artists are born cursed. They're born cursed with an inability to adjust to a profoundly sick society. The vast majority of us, because we are not born with the radiant genius and talent with which Van Gogh was born, and secondly, because you have to survive in this world, right? Sick or not, you've got to get along, you've got bills to pay, you've got families to feed, and usually for most of us, sitting around the house painting all day isn't going to do that, isn't going to provide for the people who are dependent upon us. Um, Vincent van Gogh, like many artists, was incapable of making those compromises. It wasn't in him. It's not a choice either. It isn't a matter of free will, in my view. With someone who is as burdened with the kind of genius that Van Gogh uh, was afflicted with, it's not possible. And that gets to the heart of what makes Van Gogh's story so alluring to millions of people around the world. 2 million, I think, a year are going to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. Tens of thousands, at the very least, probably hundreds of thousands are going to show up to. There's a great Van Gogh show coming up in Houston that I would like to be able to go to. We'll see in the spring and summer this year. Watch how many people flock to that. It's going to be incredible. Um, and that is the dramatic irony at the heart of Van Gogh's life story, the thing that makes it so alluring to so many. What is dramatic irony? It's when the audience knows more than the actors in a play. We know things about Van Gogh's life now in 2019, looking back more than 100 years now, 120, 130 years since Van Gogh's death in 1890 at age 37, that people in his life didn't know at the time, that people around him didn't know, his family didn't know that he was going to become an artist capable of selling paintings for 80 million bucks a pop at auction. They didn't know how the world decades later was going to receive a painting like Starry Night, which, by the way, Van Gogh sent to his brother Theo, wanting some response. He recognized Theo as his harshest critic, that is, as he is portrayed in this book by the author, talking about why Theo's feedback was so important to Vincent. It's because of the harshness of his criticism, and if Van Gogh could put one over on Theo, then maybe he was onto something. Well, Theo got Starry Night. Can you imagine this? Vincent van Gogh, hey Theo, I've just finished this painting and I've called it Starry Night, and I don't know, what do you think? Can you imagine that? Starry Night, probably the most recognizable, the most famous painting he did, maybe aside from the self-portraits with the bandage over his ear. More on that in a moment, because there's some really interesting stuff about that in this book. And Theo criticizes it for being more style than substance. Criticizes Starry Night. When Van Gogh sends a painting that also is recognized today as a masterpiece, The Potato Eaters, to a friend of his. The Potato Eaters he did in 1885, in the middle of this 10-year period when he's creating art from 1880 to 1890. And his friend calls it superficial. Says The Potato Eaters is superficial. After Van Gogh's death, months after his death, when Jo, Theo's wife, Van Gogh's sister-in-law, is trying to figure out what to do with Van Gogh's property after he's dead, and after sad as heck, Theo dies 6 months after Van Gogh. Did you know that? I didn't realize that Theo died at age 33. Vincent van Gogh died at age 37. Theo died 6 months later. He was suffering from syphilis, and judging from the symptoms that the author describes, the violence of the abruptness with which Theo became a very violent, volatile, unpredictable person who wasn't responding emotionally or otherwise to anyone around him, including his wife, with whom he has a beautiful love story that is told beautifully in this book. Um, that aspect of this whole thing is terrible. But after both of them sadly are dead, people are telling Joe to get rid of Van Gogh's paintings. Oh, just get rid of them. You're going to carry those around with you? Really? I mean, what is it anyway? People didn't recognize at the time. Some people were towards the end of Van Gogh's life. Claude Monet was recognizing at an exhibition, I think shortly before Van Gogh's death. Monet and Theo tells Van Gogh this, I think, in a letter. Said that Van Gogh's stuff was the best stuff in the exhibition. And this was Van Gogh, an unknown artist. I mean, Monet was immensely successful, very well off, really doing well, and he didn't need to pay Van Gogh any regard. But he saw, despite the fact that he had little idea who Van Gogh was, although I think he had some acquaintance with Theo, because Theo was this big art dealer, he recognized the genius in that work, and no one needed to point it out to Monet. He saw it for himself. That's amazing. But that's part of the dramatic irony. That's part of what we know today that they didn't know at the time. That this is the Vincent van Gogh who would become Vincent van Gogh, the person who is revered worldwide as a great artist today. And time and again, this comes out in this book. The struggle that Van Gogh experiences throughout his life, starving all his life, especially in his adulthood. The humiliating, emasculating failures that Van Gogh goes through, especially early in his life, when his family is telling him to get to this point about how being well-adjusted to a sick society is no sign of good health. His family is basically, I'm putting this more crudely than at least some of the people around Vincent did, with the possible exception at least of his sister Anna, with whom he had a very acrimonious relationship. Basically saying, Vincent, why don't you just shut up and get a job? I think Anna told him to try becoming a baker. Vincent van Gogh, baking. Can you imagine? Be a draftsman. Become an illustrator. Make letterheads. It was one of the pieces of advice that he got. Well, he couldn't. It wasn't possible for him, and he tried. He tried to become an art dealer. And Vincent van Gogh had a very volatile character. As beloved as he is, I'm not sure that if we had the chance to develop a relationship with him today, we would like him very much, because he was a volatile, combative person with a combative personality, fond of argument, and as an art dealer, he was not always kind or diplomatic with the customers. Imagine that. Vincent van Gogh was not born with a customer service temperament. Just wasn't in his DNA. And he gets fired from that job. Then he tries to become a preacher. His dad was a preacher. And he goes to a coal mining region, finally, after, I think, going through some studies but as a theologian, but not completing them. Does get an assignment to go up to this coal region, and in what I consider, and this is beautifully told in the book, to be a vivid glimpse of the character of the man. He is horrified, disturbed to the point of near despondency by what he sees in this mining town, these people going down into the ground and then emerging back up at the end of a workday fraught with difficulties and cruelties and deprivations, terrible working conditions down there, and emerge back to the surface of the world black as soot, poor, hungry, hopeless in their lot in life. And this disturbs Van Gogh, and he starts making drawings of their lives. And this is when he starts to become aware of his own talent and takes his first stabs at being an artist. This disturbs him so much that he wants to go down. How is this for an artist, right? He wants to go down and experience this for himself. He wants to see for himself what this world is that these poor people inhabit on a daily basis. The desperation of the scenes that they must endure to get by in life, to scrape by. He goes down into the mine himself to see what it's like, and informs informs himself of their world and then starts drawing it. Then years later, this comes out in the Potato Eaters, where the potato eaters, these peasants, gather around a table eating a simple meal of potatoes and I guess tea. There's a kettle in the painting, and it's very dark. They have bony hands, the kind of gnarled noses, very simple clothing, and you see again just the haunting shadow of his experiences in that mining town continue to loom over him years later with the Potato Eaters. So it didn't work. His father came to clean him up in this mining town, but he wasn't dressing well. He was starving himself. He was living in a shack. People were almost scared of him, just the extent to which he refused to allow himself the slightest luxury that the coal miners themselves could not enjoy. He couldn't do it. He took quite seriously this idea of embodying principles that he went there to preach, and that didn't sit well with the people who had assigned him to that post, and eventually that post came to an end as well as a result. Then he ends up back home living with his parents. This is Van Gogh's childhood into his adulthood now. He's in his 20s living with his parents again, and decides that he's an artist. And it's only because of Theo, his art dealer brother, giving him 15% of his annual income, 50 francs a month, to pay his bills, to pay for his lodging, to give him paints. Vincent van Gogh is begging him in letter after letter, not just for money, but for paints and for other materials he needs, to serve his unquenchable hunger to create. To make meaning of the disorder of life, and particularly to make meaning of the disorder of his own life, and to paint what's happening inside him, to bring out, as he says of one painting of wheat fields in a letter, extreme sadness and loneliness. In wheat fields, in landscapes, you can see his own inner turmoil. In one of his earliest paintings of a prostitute with whom he was living for some time early in his life as an artist, called Sorrow, it's really his own sorrow that he draws out of the subject of that drawing, this prostitute, one of his earliest pieces. So again, this is the dramatic irony that captivates people when they come across Vincent van Gogh's story. We know who he became. The only thing that people in his life know about him is who he was before their eyes, which was a person dressed in rags who was starving, incapable of keeping a job, got in fights with people, arguments, was difficult to be around, and it never improved. He sold one painting for his entire life, towards the end of his life, and rarely, if ever, got any kind of recognition of certainly nothing to the extent that he enjoys today. So that's one of the fascinating things that this book brings out really well and establishes importantly the role that Theo played. Then the role that Jo played after, as I mentioned, after he died. So she translates his letters, publishes them, gets them published in book form, starts talking with people like Emile Bernard about the art world, learning as much as she could about it, how to put together a proper art show and exhibition, and getting his work seen. But the letters are an important piece of the puzzle, because taken up independently of anything Van Gogh did as a painter, when you put those letters together and recognize them as a single creative work in their own right, they too constitute a work of genius. He is as intense on the page as he is on the canvas. You can read his letters for free online, look them up. Letter by letter, you can slip down that rabbit hole and spend hours down there. Just gorgeous correspondence. There's one beautiful letter where he compares the human heart to the sea and talks about how, yes, it has its tides and its storms, but in its depths, it has its pearls too. That's the kind of gorgeous prose you're going to find in Vincent's letters. Definitely want to read those, and you get a glimpse of the man and a glimpse of the man's genius and his intellect. So that's another thing that this book brings out beautifully by Deborah Heiligman, Vincent and Theo. She also, of course, talks about the incident with the ear. I alluded to that earlier, the self-portrait with the bandage over his ear. And guess what? That happens when he's living in this little yellow house in Arles in South France. Well, it turns out that he may not have cut off his own ear. And Deborah Heiligman isn't necessarily in her book endorsing this theory, but she does recognize that it's out there. She plants some seeds, some clues earlier in the book when she's talking about Paul Gauguin, with whom Van Gogh was living in this little yellow house for 9 weeks. That was all Gauguin could stand, because it was a very contentious experience. They're arguing constantly about art and theory and the ways to paint, and Gauguin is this imposing, charismatic, egotistical presence who has very fixed ideas as to how one should paint, and is to some almost ridiculing Van Gogh and the way he paints, telling Van Gogh, you got to use your imagination, don't just paint what's right in front of you, don't just go out and look at a still life or a sunflower or a wheat field and just paint what it looks like. Paint from your imagination too. What Gauguin didn't appreciate is that in painting the landscapes, and increasingly as the years went on towards Van Gogh's premature death, the radiant, robust, vibrant, brilliant color with which he was painting those landscapes, those still lifes, those self-portraits, was a reflection of what was going on within himself. So this is the interesting piece of this whole ear incident, is the author reveals that Paul Gauguin was a fencer, a guy who was good with swords, and a volatile man who could become violent. She uses the word bellicose when he was getting in arguments with people, and was known to use his weapons in arguments with people, and was known to have brought his foils, as the author puts it, to Arles. So he's got weaponry on him. He's getting in constant arguments with Van Gogh, and they finally have this culminating blowout that ends with Van Gogh missing an ear and Gauguin leaving and never returning, and they never saw each other again, although they continued to correspond by written letter. Now, how interesting is that? So there is the possibility that Van Gogh did not cut off his ear, that in fact in an argument, one of their, possibly the last one, their most heated exchange, Gauguin sliced it off, being the fencer that he was. This is why it's so important, I think, to what I've learned from this book, is it's so important to read about Van Gogh, because he's got this gargantuan reputation that has been almost appallingly romanticized, which is to say it has been simplified according to the story that people want to believe about Van Gogh. But when you read about his life, as I did with this book, you realize that actually the episodes of his life with which we feel like we are particularly familiar are far more nuanced, far more nebulous, far more complicated than we understood them to be before we really sat down and read a 400-page book about the man's life. That's another reason why I think this is such a necessary read, and why it's so fascinating to people with even a passing interest in Vincent van Gogh. Another fascinating thing is she presents several different theories as to why Van Gogh painted as quickly as he did. Vincent van Gogh, for the most part, but not always. The potato eaters, as I think I mentioned earlier, took longer. Other paintings took longer, but later in his life, when he's painting 3 paintings a day, which boggles the mind, and to me draws an analogy between Vincent van Gogh and Sylvia Plath, who at the end of her life, before her suicide, was writing 2 or 3 or more poems a day, which is extraordinary when you recognize the brilliance of the poems that she was churning out at that frenetic pace, and suggests to me that among the other ailments that Vincent van Gogh was suffering from may have been manic depressive disorder. I believe that it was in fits of mania that Sylvia Plath was creating at such an incredible pace. But also Vincent van Gogh struggled with epilepsy, tinnitus, syphilis. It didn't help that he, when living with Paul Gauguin, was indulging absinthe, which now is banned as a substance. You can't get it, but in his day, you could be poured green absinthe in the cafes of Paris. And Gauguin was a drinker, and after he was done with Van Gogh was a drinker too, and drinking absinthe, which is banned for including a toxic substance and could lead to hallucinations. He was eating his paints on at least a couple occasions in his life. He drank turpentine at least once or twice, if not more. That didn't help either. And so this is the unending desperation and sadness of the life that was Vincent van Gogh's. And it is a life story that is told so beautifully in this book. But as a result of all these health ailments that he was experiencing, Vincent van Gogh thought he wasn't going to live very long. And that was one reason why he painted in such a rush. He wasn't sure how much more time he was going to have. He also painted quickly, the author suggests, because he got started at age 27. That's late, and he was making up for lost time. There is another scholar, in fact, one of the co-authors of this other biography of his that I have, it's actually under my computer right now, but the one that came out in 2011, the 900-page brick of a biography by the two people whose biography of Jackson Pollock won a Pulitzer Prize. One of the authors there in a lecture that I found on YouTube suggests another reason he painted so quickly was because of his epilepsy. He would never know when the next seizure would overcome him. And when it did, it would interrupt, of course, his painting. And after the seizure, he wouldn't remember what happened. And he was trying to get everything onto that canvas before another epileptic spell overtook him. He never knew when it was going to happen. So he was painting in fear of the next seizure as well. This is the kind of human drama and agony, really, and anguish that was going into paintings that, to Paul Gauguin, I guess, seemed unimaginative because they seemed to be paintings merely of the real rather than from the imagination. But there was a hell of a lot more going on in these works than that commentary allowed for. His relationship with Theo is interesting because it sheds some light on the end of Van Gogh's life as well. Here's the other thing that the author touches upon, doesn't endorse this theory, but recognizes that it's out there. Van Gogh may not have killed himself. He may accidentally have been murdered. Some interesting pieces of that puzzle are as follows. In letters to Theo, at one point Theo tells Vincent, you know, I just want to disappear. Vincent van Gogh says, we must never do that. We must never act like a suicide would, he is the word he uses in his letters. He at times tells Theo that, or others, that he finds suicide to be an act of dishonest men, a disreputable thing to do. Repeatedly he has said he would never do that and doesn't recognize it as I guess an honorable thing to do or way to go. But also there was this bully in Van Gogh's life who fancied himself to be Buffalo Bill, this kid that would be seen around town twirling a gun on the trigger around his finger and bullying Van Gogh, pouring pepper into his paints so that if Van Gogh, as he was known to do, put a paintbrush in his mouth, it would burn his mouth, taunting him. And it's possible, as the authors in particular of that 2011 biography allege, that this kid was fooling around with some other kid in a field where Van Gogh was painting. You know, Van Gogh would carry his easel and walk for miles and miles to find a scene that struck him as appropriate to paint at a given moment, and just plop it right down there and paint. It helped that you had this mobile easel and you had these paints that you could squeeze out of a tube and just take with you. So the whole occupation had become mobile in a way that it wasn't previously. And in this field, the authors allege that this Buffalo Bill type character was playing with a gun and accidentally shot Van Gogh. You know, Van Gogh was shot in the upper abdomen below the heart. And if you're trying to kill yourself, why not try again if the first time didn't succeed? Well, Vincent did not try again. Why not if he was trying to take his own life? Why did he walk a mile back to his room holding his gut and then just lay on the bed and wait to die? I mean, is that something that someone whose objective is suicide would do? Those are just a couple of the questions, good ones, that these authors raise. And you'll notice if you see the new Van Gogh movie that's out with Willem Dafoe portraying Van Gogh brilliantly. It's a beautiful movie. I saw it. I recommend it. But read this book first so you can bring some knowledge about Van Gogh to the film. That movie audaciously depicts the end of Van Gogh's life as a murder, not a suicide. That is the extent to which this theory is gaining momentum. It's pretty compelling, and the author allows for it in here too. Now, Adam Gopkin in a YouTube lecture about Van Gogh that I also recommend, look it up, says, look, if he didn't kill himself, he may ultimately have done so anyway later at a later point in his life because of all of the acute suffering that he was afflicted with. Maybe that's true. Perhaps he would have. We'll never know. But the bleakness of the tragedy that befell him, if indeed he accidentally was murdered, because one of the things that the author establishes is Theo and Joe had just had this beautiful baby, Vincent, Vincent's nephew Vincent. They named him Vincent after Vincent van Gogh. He was so excited about this baby. When he makes a visit to Joe and Theo's house months before his death, I think in May when he moves back up north from Arles, strikes Joe as shockingly virile looking and determined and strong and confident and sure of his direction in life, and certainly as an artist. Yeah, he looks healthier than Theo himself does. These two are the clues not of a man who is in the throes of a suicidal depression, but a man who's eagerly wanting to continue his art. And he's painting at a frenetic pace before his death. None of this establishes or proves anything, but it certainly lends, as I said, a degree of complexity to the story that everyone thinks they know about Van Gogh and the way his life ended. I've gone on for almost 26 minutes now about this book, and I'm just going to leave the rest up to you. Get your hands on this book. It's beautifully written. It's an important analysis of the love between Vincent and Theo, the beautiful love story between Theo and Joe, the terrible way in which it ends when Theo dies 6 months after Vincent van Gogh's death from syphilis, dies alone. Vincent van Gogh, however, dies in Theo's arms. And if you can get through those pages of this book without crying, you're a tougher person than I am, because it was hard. It is that moving a work. So it's Vincent and Theo by Deborah Heiligman. I highly recommend it. What a page turner! Suspenseful, moving, incredibly well researched, passionately written. If you have, as I said, even a passing interest in Van Gogh, treat yourself to this book. It's wonderful. I hope you do, and I hope you enjoy it.